of the book Global Resurgence of the Right. As you know, this book, edited by Gastón, Souroujon, and myself, emerged as an initiative of the Center of Comparative Studies of the Faculty of Political Science and International Relations of the National University of Rosario. Our intention was for this work to reflect on the most appropriate conceptual categories to account for the phenomenon of the right and its expression in a variety of national case studies. In this way, through 13 chapters, we bring together specialists from around the world, among which is George Hawley. Last, I invite you on October 11th to the fourth talk, which will be given by José Antonio Sanauja and Camilo López Gurián. I don't want to steal any more of your time. Thank you very much for joining us today. Gastón?
Okay, thank you, Gisela. Well, welcome again to our first meeting of the presentation of this book. Today I would like to send to all those who accompany us in this meeting and those who later see us in the YouTube channel of the Centro de Estudios Comparados. So I want to thank Maria, who helped us with the connectivity and so on. On this occasion, we are pleased to have the presence of George Hawley. He's an associate professor at the Department of Political Science in the University of Alabama. He has a PhD in political science at the University of Houston. He's the author of several books like The Alt-Right, What Everyone Needs to Know, Demographic Culture and the Decline of American Christian Denomination, Making Sense of the Alt-Right. He's also the author of many articles and book chapters around the alt-right, the conservative ideology, and on electoral behavior in the American politics. We want to thank George Hawley for having collaborated with a great chapter in the book, The Global Resurgence of the Right. And of course, we also want to thank George Hawley for agreeing to be part of this talk. The title of the conference is a very interesting title and very provocative, is Why Right-Wing Populism Fails in the USA. Like always, after the conference, we will have some time for my question, comment, etc. So Hawley, you can start, and thank you again for being here.
Okay, let me see. How do I get my PowerPoint up here? I see my...
share screen?
Hold on. I have it clicked here. I don't know why it's not showing. My apologies. This is a new software for me. No, that's not what I want.
Down the camera when this
On camera.
On camera.
Okay. How about now? Can we see it? No.
No. Now, yes.
Okay, great.
Perfect,
all right, I'm going to switch screens. Hopefully, as I turn the screens, this will be visible. Anyway, thank you very much for this invitation to be here. My talk today is based on the article that I wrote for the book, The Global Resurgence of the Right. And, I wrote the article, well over a year ago, and so much has happened since then. But I think that current events have actually held up my thesis pretty well. That is, there's nothing that has happened over the past year that has made me think that this is I got anything fundamentally wrong. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get straight into the argument that I'm going to be making today. So if we think back to right after the 2016 presidential election, I think a lot of observers were very surprised, of course, by Donald Trump's victory in that presidential election. I'll note I was not one of those people who was surprised. I had been on record as predicting that Trump would win. But overall, I think most political scientists and journalists and just general observers thought that he was going to lose. And that the fact that he ran on a populist and nativist platform was significant, especially since this seemed to be occurring at times in which, this variety of right-wing populism seemed to be making gains throughout much of the world. Of course, we had at that same year the example of the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, the narrow victory of the side that wanted that country to leave the European Union. You're seeing other countries in Central Europe that had what I guess you would call sort of a nationalist or populist or right-wing government in places like Hungary and Poland. It started to look like far-right parties were gaining strength in a lot of European democracies, as well as in other places, such as obviously we have the right-wing populist examples in Brazil and in India. And it also started to look like mainstream parties were starting to adopt a lot of positions. So trend throughout the world. And the United States was perhaps kind of a global leader in a march towards the political right, and particularly a populist right. But I've been arguing for several years now that right-wing populism has some distinct disadvantages in the United States that will be very difficult to overcome. Now, just to get a couple of definitions out of the way, when I talk about populism and specifically right-wing populism, when I talk about populism, I generally rely on the terminology that was developed by the political science Casamuda, who described populism as an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues should be an expression of the general will of the people. Now, there's a lot of flexibility, ideological flexibility with that definition. It can mean a lot of different things. So that's why it's especially important to distinguish left-wing populism from right-wing populism. And the best way to do this, I think, is to consider where the populist, draws the line around the so-called people. Who is the people they're talking about? For the left-wing populist, they're usually talking about the poorer classes who are united against the wealthy and the powerful elites. Whereas right-wing populism tends to be a little bit different in that it looks at suspicion on both the elites and the poor that it considers to be the undeserving poor. So the right-wing populism is hostile to immigrants, to certain minority groups, while simultaneously condemning elites and others that they view as conspiring to undermine wages and disrupt cultural unity. So although the right-wing populist is not necessarily anti-capitalist and tends to be in favor of a robust welfare state, right-wing populists compared to conservatives, they like the welfare state more than conservatives do, but they also, they want to limit who has access to it in a way that left-wing populists generally do not. So we can think of right-wing populism as being much more extreme than its left-wing counterpart. But in any event, right-wing populism it's not a coherent and well-defined political philosophy, but it is different from mainstream American conservatism, differs from it in a few key areas. As I suggested before, the right-wing populist tends to be, if not necessarily anti-capitalist, tends to be less ideologically enamored with free markets per se. Tends to be, again, comfortable with a welfare state, provided the welfare state is targeted to the groups that it likes. Compared to conservatives, tends to be much more protectionist, and when it comes to foreign policy, tends to lean towards isolationism, as opposed to the sort of idealistic conservatism in foreign policy that we associate with someone like George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan. Now, it is true that the American conservative movement has, for many decades, often adopted a kind of a populist style, trying to sell itself as having a very much a kind of plain old folks appeal. But this is more driven by pragmatic political considerations and usually requires deviating from their own stated political principles, because American or Anglo-American conservatism has historically been kind of openly elitist and very suspicious of the so-called masses and concerned about unchecked democracy, which are things that the populist generally is not going to have such concerns with. The problem for the conservative movement, though, is that it doesn't just want to be sort of a philosophical position. It wants to be a dominant force in government. So this has required a lot of tiptoeing around being openly populist, but never really crossing that threshold in a way that Donald Trump and other right-wing populists did. Now, before we think about Trump and his movement specifically, though, we should think about some of his predecessors, some of the ways in which previous right-wing populist movements have made waves in American life, and considered what the long-term ramifications of those movements were. Because since the post-war years, we've seen a number of big explosions in right-wing populism that came and then went. If we think about, say, 1948, when Strom Thurmond led his so-called Dixiecrat revolt against the Democratic Party, largely because he was upset that the Democratic Party was becoming in favor of civil rights. That was a key early example that sort of presaged the Southern realignment that American politics scholars have studied so heavily. Probably a better remembered figure would be Alabama's own George Wallace, who had presidential runs in 1968 and 1972. He had been the Democratic governor of Alabama during the Civil Rights era, at a time when the Democratic Party was moving towards embracing its status as the party of African-American civil rights. So he would run these third-party runs, trying to run as a pro-segregation candidate, without being encumbered by any of the American conservative movement's anti-populist tendencies. So he had a very much a right-wing populist message, strengthening the welfare state while opposing foreign aid and promising to end federal efforts to combat racial segregation. But of course, Wallace would fall short in all of his presidential ambitions. The next sort of quintessential right-wing populist to run for office was Patrick Buchanan, who had been close aide to both Presidents Nixon and President Reagan, but he was disturbed by what he considered to be like the globalist turn of the Republican Party, especially under George H.W. Bush, challenged Bush for president in 1992, running on what was actually called an America First position, sort of isolationist, anti-immigration, combined with strong social conservatism. It was basically the same campaigns the same campaign that Trump would run in 2016, with just a little bit more religion mixed in. So we can think of Buchanan as being kind of a proto-Trump, though again he lost his presidential runs in all three of his presidential runs in 92, 96, and then his third party run in 2000. And then after the year 2000, right-wing populism seemed to have become a bit of a dormant force in U.S. presidential politics. In subsequent years, the Republican Party would promote its historical conservative agenda of limited government intervention in the economy, in aggressive action overseas, and cultural traditionalism. Now, although the Tea Party was something that erupted in American politics in around 2010, although this movement would take kind of a populist and anti-establishment style, in terms of policy, the so-called Tea Party was really just kind of a louder version of mainstream conservatism. All they were calling for was really the old Republican talking points, like lower taxes. There really wasn't anything new or particularly populist with the Tea Party's economic message. So what we see is that right-wing populists do seem to appear on the political scene in the United States with some regularity, but they don't tend to stay in the spotlight for very long. Usually we think of right-wing populism as fitting with a single charismatic figure, kind of almost personality cults that develop around single individuals. And then after, of course, that figure vanishes, the movement tends to die with it. The examples of people like Joseph McCarthy and his Red Scares and attacks on communists, George Wallace, who I already mentioned, the white nationalist, David Duke from the 1980s and early 90s, Ross Perot, who was a populist in his own way, and Pat Buchanan, who I mentioned before. These were all figures who, during their time spotlight, were able to mobilize a lot of Americans behind their cause, but what they failed to do, all of them, was to build any kind of lasting movement. The case of George Wallace, I think, is especially interesting. That political historians know very well in the US, activists such as Paul Weyrich and Richard Viguerie, they thought that they could really change American politics by wooing Wallace's voters to become motivated Republicans. And they thought that they could take an openly populist approach to politics where they were moderate on economics but right-wing on race, and be able to build this new movement that would appeal to both Southern and Northern whites that had previously backed the Democratic Party. And this movement was what they called the New Right. Now, this approach to politics, seems pretty sound theoretically, but they never managed to fundamentally change the Republican Party or build lasting institutions following this particular strategy. The economic conservatives weren't willing to abandon their policy position for the sake of making the electoral coalition bigger. So mainstream conservatism and its sort of very ideological approach to the free market, that ended up sticking around. They weren't able to undermine that. More importantly, for the purposes of my analysis, though, it's notable that the former George Wallace supporters actually proved extremely difficult to organize into any kind of coherent force. And in the absence of George Wallace, they really ceased to be any kind of an organized movement. And then after these failures, people like Weyrich and others associated with the New Right, they changed tactics and started focusing on trying to woo evangelical Christian leaders. And so they didn't get the Wallace voters mobilized, but they did help to create what came to be known as the Christian Right, which would soon become a dominant force in the conservative movement and the Republican Party. Now, it's notable, or I think it's notable, that although the Christian Right and the sort of the George Wallace electoral base, they had some overlap, but they were not synonymous, and they did have different priorities. So who is the constituency for right-wing populism in America? I would argue that the electoral base of right-wing populist movement is always going to be described by a sociologist named Donald Warren in the 1970s, a group he called the Middle American Radicals. And this is a group that generally we can describe as being mostly middle-class white people, especially people without college degrees. They're the dominant part of this group, according to Warren, and I would agree with that analysis. But the thing to note also is Warren argued that this is a group that's not so much defined by its objective demographic or economic attributes. Instead, you define them more by their particular ideology. It's an ideology that's not really interested in conservatism per se, not interested in, we think about like what's said in magazines like National Review or whatever. They're not interested in limited government per se. On the other hand, though, although they're not ideologically committed to small government, they also think that liberals in the US or progressives had mostly stopped supporting their interests. That is, as the Democratic Party increasingly became the party of civil rights, the party of immigrants, etc., they started to feel alienated from the Democratic Party, and as such, kind of alienated from mainstream American politics per se. And according to Warren, and again, I'm not saying that this attitude they have is justified, but they think this is how they think about politics. They say, he said, the middle American mindset we can summarize as follows, quote, the rich give in to the demands of the poor, and the middle income people have to pay the bill, end quote. So that is, it's a middle class that's feeling squeezed by rich people who will always be able to be fine no matter what, raising taxes on the middle in order to pay off the so-called underclass is their attitude towards how politics is working. It's a group that feels that the top and the bottom has allied against the center. And now it's notable also, this is not a group that's necessarily interested at all in the same social issues as the Christian right, but they're culturally conservative in a more generic sense. That is, they feel that the left, and to some degree the Democratic Party, has begun denigrating traditional American culture. Back in the 1970s, they were very strongly anti-communist, but again, not really committed to kind of the quasi-libertarian economics that we have associated with conservative intellectuals. And when Warren was writing his book, the Democratic Party really had transitioned into being, the party of civil rights. And this was in part due to George McGovern's candidacy in 1972. And so a lot of Americans were viewing the Democrats as the party of the far left. And as Warren was trying to figure out that, I think I went a slide ahead too quickly there. As Warren was trying to figure out exactly how much of the population this was, he used basically a battery of opinion polls to try and see, okay, how much of the population fits this, this ideological category. And he decided, based on what he was looking at, about 29% of white Americans fit this description. So, about 30%, or a third of American whites, is a group that's, far from being able to constitute a majority of the population. But it's still, as far as demographic groups go, or ideological groups go, it's pretty large. It's large enough to, be potential kingmakers or game changers in a presidential election. However, despite having potential to be a very significant political force in American life, it has been a political force when there's been someone able to activate them in presidential elections. The middle American radical, as defined by Warren, really has a very poor track record of actually organizing for political action. The group that we might think of as having in a previous historical era been focused on this group's interests, labor unions had already undergone a fundamental change. Labor unions had already become, say, a group that had been more in favor of civil rights, more in favor of generous immigration policies, et cetera. And so in the absence of labor unions, there really wasn't a single institution that we could think of as being strongly in favor of the middle American radical. And so there ended up not being, there's historically, at least for the last generation, not been powerful institutions standing specifically for this ideological category. That said, as mentioned, there have been historically political figures that will show up as sort of the champion of this demographic, or this potential political group. And the most recent example we have of this, and the most successful that we've ever seen, was President Donald Trump, who ran as an explicit right-wing populist, even if he didn't use that term to describe himself. As I mentioned before, conservatives, conservative Republicans have in the past, used certain populist talking points, but in substance, most of them have adhered pretty closely to what we might consider, the traditional conservative policies, limited government, hawkish foreign policies, focus on traditional values, whatever one thinks of those policies or those major principles. That's been consistent themes among Republican presidential contenders. But Trump was different in that he demonstrated zero interest in, conservatism. And most of the substance of his campaign was pretty populist. And his agenda was at odds with mainstream conservatism on a lot of points. Although immigration restrictionism is not something that conservatives are necessarily opposed to, we haven't seen a Republican presidential contender, at least not a leading one, take such a firm stance, such a firm nativist stance, at least since the 1990s. This was a really a strongly nativist approach that Trump took during his campaign that was very much at odds with what we had seen among previous Republican candidates. Trade is another issue, of course, where there was a major rejection the conservative tradition. That is, the conservative tradition had been for a couple of generations to at least rhetorically been in favor of free trade and in favor of generally being in favor of trade agreements, whereas Trump has been consistently in favor of protectionist policies in defense of native industries. And this is actually one of the few on which Trump has been intellectually consistent in his public life, that he has been saying at least since the 1980s. And then, of course, in just general conservative talking points, he has shown no interest in being conservative per se. He didn't run as a candidate in 2016. He didn't call on privatizing Social Security or any of the other things that we often associate with conservative presidential contenders. And he very much broke with conservative and Republican tradition on some of these economic issues. And then he goes on to win the election, and it looks like, wow, there's going to be this major sea change in the Republican Party and in American life as a result of this. That's the presumption. And then he gets into office, and the most surprising thing is that despite winning on a populist platform, President Trump really didn't follow through in any meaningful sense on any of his if we think about the signature achievements of the Trump administrations, the ones they were touting during this re-election bid, it was all things like tax cuts or conservative Supreme Court justices or the movement of the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Whenever one thinks of these policies, they were in line with mainstream conservatism. They were not a populist break with what the Republican Party had traditionally been. Now, Trump did push some protectionist measures, but, to date, they really didn't do much, as far as I can tell, to really fundamentally restructure America's relations with the world or do anything to substantive flagging industries. And then, of course, we have the issue he had a lot of freedom, I should note, to try and promote certain things during his first 2 years in office, because he was presumably the leader of the Republican Party at that point, and the Republican Party dominated Congress during this time. Yet, there was no border wall that was pushed. And there wasn't any major legislative change to American immigration policy. There were some changes, but they were mostly administrative ones that could be done through the executive branch. They weren't in what the law actually stated. So they were sort of working with what they could in the executive branch, as opposed to pushing for major new policies out of Congress. So that means we got things such as the so-called travel ban that was placed on several majority Muslim countries, which was incredibly controversial. And then more controversial was the treatment of asylum seekers, and those who cross the border illegally, the family separation policy, etc. But again, these were things that will, in the long run, have no real significant effect on American demographic trends. Sort of the basic trajectory of the United States in terms of what its future demographic makeup looks like hasn't been fundamentally altered by the Trump administration. It's also notable that people hired by the House are not really what you'd expect from somebody who was a really doctrinaire right-wing populist, right? Because despite his promise that he was going to quote, drain the swamp, that is, get rid of all the Washington insiders, really, as president, he mostly surrounded himself with longtime Republican insiders. Mostly were people who came from the Republican mainstream, including his vice president. And including, I should note, a lot of people in the White House were people who had vocally opposed him during the Republican primaries. And these are people who dominated his cabinet. And these were not people who were personally committed to realizing Trump's campaign priorities. Steve Bannon suggested that this was one of the administration's great failings. Steve Bannon had previously been at Breitbart. He's kind of a right-wing populist guy as well. Had been worked for the administration for about 8 months, and then was fired. anyway, this is how he's put it. He said, quote, "You might call it the original sin of the administration. Embraced the establishment. I mean, we totally embraced the establishment," end quote. Now, besides Bannon, there were a couple of other figures that we can think of as having a right-wing populist or quasi-right-wing populist ideological framework that we're working from. Attorney General Jeff Sessions, for example, and White House senior advisor Stephen Miller. But they were in the decided minority in terms of the people who really had Trump's ear and were directing policy in the White House. Now, what's notable is that in some ways this might have been unavoidable. That is, if let's say Trump had wanted to fill his White House with people who were totally on board with the right-wing populist agenda. Well, unfortunately, there weren't any such people really who had experience running a government. And this is because right-wing populism followed a very different trajectory than did the conservative movement as it was growing in strength. If we think about sort of the step-by-step process by which conservatism grew from a mostly marginalized kind of intellectual movement, centered around a few journalists and a few publications in the early 1950s, to eventually becoming a powerful force in the Republican Party, eventually getting Barry Goldwater his nomination for the presidency, powerful think tanks and other institutions, raising massive sums of money, growing its ranks through the birth of things like the Christian right. All were things that created a powerful institution for ideological conservatism, so that when Reagan was elected in 1980, there was this powerful infrastructure in place, including lots of members of Congress that shared the president's ideology, that had an interest in promoting a particular ideological agenda. And so there was no shortage of qualified staff committed to Ronald Reagan's vision. Whereas Trump, he championed this ideology in the White House, but he didn't have any kind of organized movement behind it. There was just him and his personality and the people who liked him. And then he manages to win, and there weren't really a lot of experienced or competent Washington insiders who had shared the real animating principles of the Trump campaign, who were able to then take the helm and redirect the Republican Party to this new populist agenda. On foreign policy, most Republicans were still hawks. Trump said he wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, was never able to do it. Was always convinced not to by the generals, by people in the Republican establishment. And although and also most of his most people that are in leadership in the Republican Party, they remain committed to free trade. And one of the things Trump promised on the campaign trail was a big amount of infrastructure investment. Well, Republicans in Congress, had no interest, didn't make it a big part of their agenda when they had the chance. And then, of course, although Republicans are split on the question of immigration, there is a contingent of Republicans that favor generous immigration policies, others that are highly restrictionist. When Trump controlled the White House and the Republicans controlled both chambers of Congress, Republican leaders didn't want to focus on immigration. They instead went back to traditional Republican issues, tax cuts, and their failed effort to repeal President Obama's signature policy achievement, the Affordable Care Act. That proved unsuccessful, but that's where they spent a lot of their political capital. They didn't do things like appropriate for a border wall or substantively change U.S. immigration law. Now, there was some recognition early on among Trump's supporters that there was this deficiency they had to resolve. There were some efforts to try to kind of reverse engineer an intellectually coherent Trumpism, for lack of a better term. And we saw it with, various conservative books and magazines, trying to lay out a new case for nationalism, for example, that would be congruent both with conservative policies and with the vision that Trump was laying out. We were seeing, new publications such as American Affairs trying to, build a kind of humane and intellectually serious variety of Trumpism that might be able to make Trumpian themes outlast Trump the person. And of course, in the popular media, where there is always, a little bit more explicit populism to begin with, Fox News started to take a more aggressively right-wing populist stance, especially with its leading figure, Tucker Carlson. A lot of the conservative media that had previously been very hostile to Trump in 2015 and 2016 generally took a conciliatory approach after he won the election. But I think big part of this was because, Trump was largely giving them things that they wanted. It's not so much that they were changing to become Trumpists. It's more that, Trumpism tended to actually give the mainstream conservative movement the kind of policies that it had long been asking for. And I should note that in the time since Trump was elected, there's been some effort, but not as much as people were expecting, or at least not as much successful effort as people were expecting, to sort of create a new breed of Trumpian candidates. Perhaps it's because, Trump's unique personality is very difficult to create, and sort of Trump, the personality, is more significant than Trump, the policy agenda. But in any event, the effort to create a new crop of right-wing populist Congress or right-wing populist governors or whatever that is fundamentally distinct from, the more mainstream conservatism has not really been successful. Well, we have a few examples. We could say Josh Hawley from Missouri, or Matt Gaetz from Florida, or Marjorie Taylor Greene. They kind of represent a different type of Republican, but there has not yet, at this point, been a fundamental change in the Republican Party. And so when Trump finally exits the scene, and it might take a while because I think he actually has a good chance of getting the Republican nomination in 2024, will something called Trumpism continue to exist without Trump the person? I don't know that it will. Part of it, of course, is that if you're trying to build kind of a...
We don't listen.
Business interests open in the Republican Party. Not a lot of them have a lot of interest in, say, new trade restrictions, or although immigration restrictionism is very popular among a lot of Republicans, immigration restrictionism is not aligned with a lot of powerful business interests. And so if you're trying to build a new sort of political infrastructure to push a right-wing populist agenda, you're going to have to do so really on a shoestring budget, and which is going to make it hard to get rid of the already existing conservative ideology within the Republican Party. So Trump is still able to draw big crowds to his rallies, but there really isn't a lot of follow-up. And so, any type of effort to turn his support into a meaningful collective action to push the Republican Party in a certain direction, has yet to really materialize as far as I'm concerned. And then finally, one thing that makes the United States a particularly difficult case if you are kind of new on the ideological scene is that we have an electoral system that essentially ensures a two-party system, because we have our plurality rule, single-member districts, which really closes off third parties as a viable option. And this makes the United States different from a lot of countries where we've seen the far right have a lot of success by organizing outside of pre-existing political parties. In the United States, if you want to push a new agenda, you really still have to work within the confines of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And as you're doing that, you are really going to be fighting against entrenched interests that want to keep things going as they had been going, which is a disadvantage for right-wing populists in the United States, which they wouldn't have if they were able to simply have a good shot at securing representation in Congress in the absence of winning outright majorities. So to conclude, with the election of Donald Trump, the United States like it was going to be on the forefront of this new trend of right-wing populism in the Western world. And, he did have a very populist, very angry, a very right-wing Twitter feed, and he did tend to promote populist themes. But we really didn't see a lot of substantive change. And this, I'm not telling people to not be concerned about right-wing populism or about the far right. Obviously, things we need to be concerned about a potential rise in, violence from right-wing extremists. These things need to be taken very seriously. But, a lot of people feared, or some hoped, that Trump would lead to a major break from ongoing political, economic, or demographic trends in the U.S. And so far, we haven't seen this really occur. So there is this constituency for right-wing populism, but translating right-wing populism into a policy agenda that is able to move through, the national legislature proved extremely difficult, even when they controlled even when they had the White House under President Trump. So, although the 2016 presidential election was unquestionably the most dramatic political victory for this political tendency, I'd say that its long-term success remains in doubt, and that this was true even before Trump lost the 2020 presidential election. And with that, that concludes what I had to say.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I don't know. It's very, very interesting. I don't know if there are any question. I will start doing some questions.
There are a lot of questions.
Sí, para que no.
I have one too, but.
Okay. I start and then we read it, okay?
Okay.
A ver si no los repito. Okay. When you start your conference, you say that for you it wasn't a surprise that Trump win. Why it wasn't a surprise for you that Trump win the presidency? The second question is that you see more Trump administration for you is more a continuity than a crash from the other administration of the Republican. You can, but what are the keys for you to understand the attack on the Capitol on the 2021, taking this question? I don't know if you want to answer or read another question.
If you keep going, I will lose track. So I'll do those two first.
Okay.
The first one about the why I thought Trump might win, that goes back to a book I wrote in 2014, a book called White Voters in 21st Century America, where I argued in that book that probably the most viable route for a Republican to win the next couple of presidential elections was not to focus so much on trying to win back, say, Latino supporters in the Southwest and places where they were losing support, but instead to zero in on the upper Midwest, sort of the Great Lakes states that had what we call in the U.S. the Rust Belt, and that a kind of a quasi-populist approach to taking those states back had the highest probability of victory of all the different strategies that the Republicans could use. And so then when I see in 2016 that Trump was largely, following the trajectory that I suggested had a high probability of success, I've bet on my own predictions and say I thought he had a chance of winning that. And that to be the region that gave him his margin of victory. The second question about the, if I correctly, was about what the January 6th attacks mean in my view. What I found most fascinating about the January 6th insurrection was the lack of any kind of real ideological coherence to it. That is, the so-called alt-right, the white nationalist movement that had been making such waves. We know it had its event in Charlottesville that made headlines across the globe. Its ideological very clear, right? That was a very explicit right-wing racial event, pushing a white nationalist agenda. January 6th, there was certainly a contingent of some of the same people that you would have seen at Charlottesville, but it was also, demographic demographically, I would say much older in terms of the people there, and a confused mix of, conspiracy theories that are not really directly connected to a major ideology, sort of the QAnon phenomenon, which this truly monstrous theory involving, we don't need too deep into the weeds there, but QAnon was a major force, and also just general Republicans were there. But it was, rather than even being about Trumpism, it seemed like it was only about Trump himself, or Trump the person. That over the past couple of years, rather than build an ideology that will outlast him, Trump has mostly just built what I would call a personality cult around himself. There are these people who, are very enamored with Trump the man, but whatever Trump says, even if there's no consistency, no ideological or policy consistency to it, they don't seem to care. They didn't seem to mind that the Trump administration didn't follow through on the promises of the Trump campaign of 2016. So right now, Trumpism is whatever Donald Trump says it is, which is a kind of an interesting phenomenon, I think.
Okay. Well,
I have a question. George, in the campaign, it seems that Trump imposed himself to the Republicans. However, the party tend to set the agenda instead. Can you say that the right wing or the conservative eat the radical right during the government, the administration of Trump?
I would say yes, for the most part. I mean, I don't want to say that there were no discontinuities between, say, Trump administration and previous Republicans. But if you can set aside, the conspiracy theories, the Twitter feed, the outrageous war against the media, behind the scenes, the people who were actually making policy, were the same people who would have been there under any Republican administration, and they still had their specific agenda. There were still, the various, foundations related to, say, like the Koch Foundation and these other groups that were pushing money towards a very specific ideological agenda. And they had a lot of success in 2017 and 2018 in, using the Trump presidency for their own ends, even when it was incongruous with the policy promises that he made in 2016.
Okay, we have a lot of questions of Juan Luca. I will read some of them. And this is interesting. Is there a populist demo in the USA without a leader? Is there something like Trumpist, but without Trump after 2020? The other one is from Andres. Do you think that Trump can run for president outside the Republican Party, or break with the bipartisanship that have dominated the American politics?
In response to the latter question, yes, he could, but I don't think he has the energy to create a separate party infrastructure. I think it's quite likely that he will run for the Republican nomination in 2024, and I think it's actually very likely that he's going to get it. I don't know that he could win a general election at that point, but I don't. If he were to lose his efforts to get the Republican nomination for 2024, and he tried to run a third-party candidacy, which is quite a challenge, I should note, because you have to get yourself on the ballot in all 50 states to be viable, or at least in the overwhelming majority of states, and every state has different rules. It'd be quite a logistical challenge to do this. All he would do is split the party. It would be an example. It would be just like when Theodore Roosevelt in 1912 was angry that Taft got the Republican nomination, so he ran as a third-party candidate and just made it quite easy for Woodrow Wilson to secure the election. As much as people and a lot of Republicans love Trump, many remain loyal to the Republican Party. So a Trump third-party run would just essentially assure a victory by Democrats in 2024. The first question, if I'm remembering, is there kind of a populist sort of culture, political culture that exists outside if there's not a Trump in the future?
Yes.
I would say yes, and that there's always going to be that constituency for it, but it requires a leader to be activated. You could argue that sort of the resentments that Trump tapped into have always been present, but in the absence of a political entrepreneur using them to build a political movement or a political campaign, they remain, for the most part, dormant. So they really need that charismatic leader to be activated, especially since, for the reasons I mentioned, this proves to be a demographic that is very difficult to form into long-term institutions.
Okay, I have another question. I know that you've been studying the alt-right. You write a lot of book about this. Why do you think that the alt-right failed to become a political actor in the USA?
Well, I think part of their mistake was thinking that because Trump won the election, that meant that they were somehow in power. That is, there was a sense, I think, among a lot of people in that movement that the 2016 election was kind of a referendum about them, that it was really that, okay, if Trump wins, that means that white nationalism is won. And in a kind of an indirect way, you could say that was true. But the fact of the matter is that even white conservative Republicans who have high anti-immigrant attitudes and maybe high levels of racial resentment, most of them still they are not interested in explicit white supremacist or white nationalist policies. They would prefer, to the extent that they want race to be an element, they'd rather their racial agenda be not quite so explicit. They kind of actually like it as with a degree of plausible deniability, because the taboo against white Americans organizing as white Americans per se is pretty strong in the United States, and it's the morality of that is generally accepted even by a lot of very right-wing Republicans. So when the alt-right decided to just come out and say, okay, they're in favor of explicit white right-wing identity politics, thinking that there was this huge constituency for that, I think they were wrong. I think that it wasn't as strong as they thought, because even Trump felt it necessary to say not always especially believably, that he was an anti-racist, right? And this is how the right prefers to organize. Another problem with the alt-right, I think, is the degree to which it was so explicitly anti-Republican. I think they underestimated the degree to which Trump's base, even though they weren't interested in, say, conservative ideology, really were committed to the Republican Party for the most part. And so as the alt-right was, saying, oh, the goal is to kind of destroy the Republican Party or reshape the Republican Party in their own image and, get rid of, Reaganism and all of the old symbolism that's associated with American conservatism. I think there wasn't as big of a constituency for that either as a lot of the prominent figures in the alt-right thought there was. So between all of that, I think that obviously major mistakes were made on the part of alt-right leaders. But even if they had not had so many errors over the course of 2016 and 2017, I'm not sure that there was ever a real viable path, at least in the United States as it is now, for that to have become a dominant ideology within a major political party.
Okay, one more question for Juan Luca. What continuity do you find between Wallace and Trump? Don't you think that there are some ideas that they share?
I would say yes, but Trump might not even know it. I think Trump is historically a very ignorant person. I mean, I don't think that's a particularly controversial thing to say. I don't think even his most fervent supporters would claim that he's an expert on these things. I think he was tapping into something very similar to what Wallace was tapping into, even though sort of the specific policy items are different. So yes, I would say that we do see some continuities between Trump and Wallace. But I don't want to overstate it in a way that suggests that Trump was being particularly deliberate about this. But in terms of activating certain racial resentments, racial anxieties, you could definitely see that, and while simultaneously wanting to shore up and defend existing important social entitlement programs, in that regard, we see some strong similarities between the Trump movement and the Wallace movement.
Okay, the last one I promise, from Juan Luca again. Did Trump add to the right-wing populism something new in the agenda of the right-wing populism? Or is there a difference between right-wing populist agenda and that of the Trump?
Populism is kind of a tendency, but it's a poorly defined one. Not very many people in the electorate would describe themselves as right-wing populists. So, so there wasn't a specific agenda for him to, in particular deviate from, if that makes sense. So, he was a right-wing populist in the sense that I define it, but, right-wing populist is nonetheless, kind of a vague term. Populism has been described in the past as what's called a thin ideology. So an ideology that doesn't have, a specific agenda. So in this sense, there wasn't a particular ideology. The ideology wasn't specific enough for him to be breaking with something that was pre-existing, if that makes sense.
Okay, well, George, now again we have to say thank you for your time, for your knowledge. It was a pleasure for us and for the Centro de Estudios Comparados of the university when we are. So thank you for the public that listen and participate, Juan Lucas, Andres, and the next meeting will be, Gisela, in October?
11.
In October 11. Okay. Thank you again. Sure. Well, it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye. Thank you a todos.